I want to tell you something before I get into this next story. After everything that happened at that cabin in the Adirondacks, I made myself a promise. I told myself I was going to be more careful, more aware, that I wasn't going to put myself in situations where I was isolated and vulnerable. I had learned my lesson, and I was going to move forward with that lesson firmly in mind. But here's the thing about lessons. Sometimes you learn them, and then life comes along and puts you in a situation where everything you learned suddenly doesn't feel like enough. Because the next time something happened, it wasn't just me. It was my family. And that changes everything. It was a few months after the cabin incident. Things had settled down. Life had gone back to normal. And my wife and I decided that we needed a break. Not just me, all of us. The kids had been working hard in school. My wife had been dealing with a lot at home. And I had been traveling constantly for work. We were all running on empty. And we needed something to reset. So we decided to take a short family vacation. Nothing extravagant. Just a few days near the ocean. Somewhere we could breathe, relax, and actually spend time together without the noise of everyday life pulling us in different directions. We started looking at options and eventually found a house on Airbnb that seemed perfect. It wasn't directly on the beach, but it was only a short walk away. It was more affordable than the hotels in the area. It had enough rooms for everyone, and the photos looked clean, comfortable, and inviting. There was even a backyard that backed up against a small creek, which gave the whole property a private, tucked away feeling. My wife loved it immediately. The kids were excited the moment we told them we were going to the beach. And honestly, I was looking forward to it too. After everything that had happened at the cabin, the idea of being somewhere with my whole family around me actually felt reassuring, less isolating, safer. I booked it without hesitation. The drive there was exactly what you'd expect from a family road trip. The kids argued for the first hour, then fell asleep, then woke up and asked how much longer about 15 times. My wife and I talked, listened to music, drank too much coffee from gas station cups. By the time we pulled up to the house, everyone was tired but in a good mood, and the house looked great in person. It was a nice-sized property, well maintained, with a comfortable front porch and big windows that let in a lot of light. The street it was on was quiet, just a few other houses spread out with plenty of space between them. And behind the house, just like the listing had described, there was a small creek running through the trees. You could hear the water from the backyard. It was genuinely peaceful. We unloaded the car, got everyone settled into their rooms, and within an hour the kids were already asking when we could go to the beach. So we didn't waste any time. That first day at the ocean was everything a family vacation is supposed to be. The weather was perfect. The sky was clear and blue, the kind of blue that makes everything feel lighter. The kids ran straight into the water the moment their feet hit the sand, laughing and splashing and completely forgetting every argument they had ever had with each other. My wife and I sat on the beach and just watched them, and for a while, neither of us said anything. We just sat there, listening to the waves, feeling the sun, and letting the stress of the past few months slowly dissolve. It was one of those days you want to hold on to. We stayed until the late afternoon, until the kids were tired and sunburned and satisfied. In that deep, happy way that only a full day at the beach can produce. We walked back to the house, rinsed off, and my wife started making dinner while the kids relaxed in their rooms. I sat out on the back porch for a while, listening to the creek, watching the light fade through the trees behind the yard. Everything felt exactly right. Dinner was easy and comfortable. We ate together at the table, talked about what we wanted to do the next day, and the kids were so tired they could barely keep their eyes open by the time we finished. We got everyone into bed, cleaned up, and my wife and I stayed up a little while longer just talking. That night, I slept better than I had in months. And no strange sounds, no uncomfortable feelings, no sense that something was off, just a dark, quiet room and the faint sound of the creek outside and 8 hours of actual, real sleep. I woke up the next morning feeling genuinely good. But when I came downstairs and saw my son sitting at the breakfast table, I knew immediately that something was wrong. He was quiet, too quiet. He was just sitting there, staring at his food, not eating, not talking. My son is not a quiet kid. He talks constantly about everything, to anyone who will listen. So the silence was noticeable immediately. I sat down across from him and asked if he was okay. He nodded, but didn't look up. I asked if he had slept all right. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, very carefully, like he wasn't sure if he should say it at all, he said he saw ghosts last night. I want to be honest, my first reaction was not concern. My first reaction was the same reaction any parent would have. I assumed it was a dream, a nightmare, maybe the new environment, the unfamiliar room, the sounds of the creek outside his window. Kids have vivid imaginations, and sleeping somewhere new for them. First time can do strange things to your mind. So I asked him to tell me what he saw, and he did. He said he woke up in the middle of the night and looked out his bedroom window, and outside, near the tree line at the back of the yard, he saw shapes, dark shapes, moving slowly along the edge of the trees, coming closer to the house and then pulling back into the darkness again. He said there were more than one, and then he said something that made me pause. He said one of them waved at him, not in a friendly way, not like someone saying hello. He described it as slow, deliberate, like whoever it was wanted him to know they were there. My wife had come downstairs by then and heard the last part of what he was saying. She looked at me over his head, and I could see in her face that she wasn't sure what to make of it either. We both stayed calm, told him it was most likely just a dream, that sometimes when you sleep somewhere, your brain creates things that feel very real but aren't. He didn't look convinced, but he was a kid, and kids are resilient, and by the time breakfast was finished, and we were talking about going back to the beach, he seemed lighter, less burdened by whatever he had seen or dreamed the night before. We went back to the beach, and the day was good again. Not quite as perfect as the first day. There was a cloud cover that kept the sun from coming through fully, and the kids were a little more subdued, but still good. Still the kind of day that reminds you why vacations exist. We came back to the house in the late afternoon, and that's when I noticed the front door. It was unlocked. I stood there for a second, just looking at it. I was certain I had locked it when we left. I specifically remembered doing it because after the cabin experience, locking doors had become something I did automatically, without thinking. Every single time, I asked my wife if she had gone back inside for anything after we left. She hadn't. I checked the house quickly, moving through every room, checking every window, every closet. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing was missing. Everything appeared exactly as we had left it. But the door had been unlocked, and I couldn't explain it. I didn't say anything to the kids. I didn't want to alarm anyone over something that might have a perfectly simple explanation. Maybe I had just made a mistake. Maybe I had thought I locked it, but hadn't fully engaged the lock. It happens. I locked it properly this time, made sure of it, and we moved on with the evening. But something had shifted in me, that awareness I had developed after the cabin, that quiet, constant alertness had turned back on. And once it's on, it doesn't turn off easily. That night, after dinner, after the kids were in bed, after my wife had fallen asleep, I lay in the dark and listened to the house, and I told myself I was just being paranoid. But I didn't fully believe it. I don't know exactly what time it was when I heard it. Late. That much I knew. The house was completely still. My wife was asleep beside me, and the only sound was the faint movement of the creek outside. I had been drifting in and out of sleep for a while, not fully resting, just hovering in that uncomfortable space between awake and asleep where your mind stays active even when your body is exhausted. And then I heard knocking, not loud, not aggressive, just a soft, quiet knock coming from somewhere down the hall. I opened my eyes and lay still for a moment, listening. It came again. I sat up slowly, trying not to wake my wife, and looked toward the bedroom door. The hallway outside was dark and quiet. I waited another few seconds, and then I heard my son's voice, small, frightened. Dad? I was out of bed before he finished the word. I crossed the room and opened the door, and he was standing there in the hallway in his pajamas, his arms wrapped around himself, his face pale in the dim light coming through the window at the end of the hall. He was shaking, not the kind of shaking that comes from being cold, the kind that comes from being genuinely, deeply scared. I crouched down in front of him and kept my voice as calm as I could manage. I asked him what was wrong. He looked at me for a second, like he was trying to decide how to say it, and then he said, "They're outside again." I felt something tighten in my chest. I stood up and took his hand and walked him back to his room. His window faced the backyard, the same window he had looked out of the night before when he said he saw the shapes near the tree line. I moved to the window carefully and looked out. At first, I saw nothing. Just the backyard, the dark outline of the trees at the far end, the faint glimmer of the creek catching a little moonlight. Everything still, everything quiet. I almost said, "See, there's nothing there." but my son was pulling at my hand, pointing toward the left side of the yard, near the corner where the fence met the tree line. "There," he whispered. They were right there. I looked harder, and I still saw nothing, but then the backyard floodlight turned on. By itself. It was motion activated. I knew that. It was designed to turn on if something moved in the yard. I had noticed it the first evening when a branch had blown across the grass and triggered it briefly. But there was no wind right now. The yard was completely still, and the light was on. I stared at the yard for a long moment, scanning every corner, every shadow. The light was bright enough to illuminate most of the grass, but the edges near the tree line were still dark. Still thick with shadow. I couldn't see anything, but something had triggered that light. I pulled my son away from the window and brought him into our bedroom. I woke my wife quietly and told her what was happening, keeping my voice low, and even so the kids wouldn't hear the worry in it. She sat up immediately, fully awake the way parents get when something involves their children. We decided to bring both kids into the living room and stay together for the rest of the night. I told them we were having a little family sleepover. Kept it light, kept it calm. My daughter thought it was fun. My son just looked relieved to not be alone. We set up blankets and pillows on the couches and the floor. My wife put on a movie at low volume, something easy and familiar. The kids started to relax. My daughter fell asleep within 20 minutes. My son lasted a little longer, but eventually his eyes closed too. My wife looked at me from across the room. I could see the question in her face. I shook my head slightly, meaning I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what was outside. I didn't know if it was anything at all, but I also didn't want to say that out loud, because saying it out loud would make it more real than I was ready for it to be. We agreed without words to just stay awake and watch. The house stayed quiet. An hour passed, then another. Bym. My wife had fallen asleep sitting upright on the couch. I was the only one still awake, sitting in the armchair near the window, watching the front of the house through the gap in the curtains. Every few minutes I would get up and check the back, look out at the yard, scan the tree line. Every time, nothing. I started to think maybe I had overreacted. Maybe the floodlight had been triggered by an animal. A raccoon, a deer, something completely ordinary. It happened all the time in areas near wooded land. My son had probably had a nightmare the first night, and his imagination had carried it into the second. Kids do that. They build things up. I was almost convinced. And then my son woke up, not slowly, not naturally. He shot upright like something had grabbed him. His eyes wide open, his breathing fast and sharp. I was across the room in seconds. I put my hand on his shoulder and asked him what happened. He grabbed my arm with both hands. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad, they're here. They're right outside." I looked at the sliding glass door at the back of the living room. The backyard floodlight was on again, and this time, I didn't need my son to point them out. I saw them immediately, 3 figures, standing in the backyard. They were dressed entirely in black dark jackets, dark pants, dark shoes, and they were wearing masks. Not Halloween masks, not costume masks, tactical style face coverings that hid everything except their eyes. And their eyes caught the light from the floodlight in a way that made them look almost unnatural, bright, focused, watching. They were standing completely still, just looking at the house, looking at us. For a moment I couldn't move. I just stood there staring at them through the glass, my son's hand still gripping my arm, my brain trying to process what I was actually seeing. And then one of them moved. He took a slow step toward the house, then another, and that's when everything in the room woke up at once. My wife opened her eyes and looked toward the door and saw them, and the sound that came out of her was something I had never heard from her before. Not a scream exactly, something deeper than that. The sound a person makes when real fear hits them all at once. My daughter woke up from the sound and looked toward the door and immediately started crying, grabbing her mother without fully understanding what she was looking at. My son was still holding my arm, completely silent now, which was somehow worse than if he had been screaming. And the figure at the front kept moving toward the glass door. Slowly, like he had all the time in the world. My daughter grabbed her phone from beside her pillow and dialed 911. Her hands were shaking, but she did it. And I heard the line connect and her voice come out high and terrified as she tried to explain what was happening and where we were. I grabbed the only thing nearby that could serve as any kind of protection, a large, heavy walking stick that had been leaning against the wall near the back door, similar to the one at the cabin. almost like the universe had placed it there on purpose. I moved toward the glass door. The figure at the front had reached the door now. I could see his hands moving toward the handle, testing it, checking whether it was locked. It was, but that didn't stop him from trying again. My wife was pulling both kids toward the far side of the room, away from the door, putting as much distance between them and the glass as possible. I could hear her voice behind me, steady and low, telling them to stay close, stay quiet, stay calm, doing everything a mother does when she is terrified but refuses to let her children see it. I stood at the door. The figure on the other side looked directly at me, and for a long moment, neither of us moved. I could see his eyes through the mask. Clear, alert, patient. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't rushing. He was waiting behind him. The other two figures hadn't moved from where they were standing. Just watching, just waiting. The whole thing felt calculated in a way that made it more frightening than if they had been aggressive. Aggression you can respond to. Patience is harder to read. And then, from somewhere in the distance, sirens. The sirens started faint, like they were meant for someone else, somewhere else. But they got louder fast, much faster than I expected. The figure at the glass door heard them too. I saw it in the way he went still for a split second, the brief pause when someone realizes the situation has changed. His head turned slightly toward the sound, then back to me. And then everything happened very fast. Blue and red lights swept across the front of the house. Car doors, voices, loud, commanding, cutting through the night like they were designed to end situations exactly like this one. The figure at the door took one step back, then another, and then he ran. All three of them moved at once, scattering in different directions across the backyard, heading for the tree line. For a moment, it looked like they might make it. The yard was dark beyond the reach of the floodlight, and the trees were close, but they didn't make it. I heard the crash before I saw what caused it. One of them went down hard near the back fence, taken down by an officer who had come around the side of the house. The other two made it to the edge of the yard before more officers came through the tree line from the other side. They had surrounded the property. The shouting outside lasted less than a minute. Then there was a struggle. Then commands being repeated, firm and loud. Then the sound of handcuffs. And then finally, silence. I stood at the glass door, still holding the walking stick, not quite ready to put it down. My wife had both kids wrapped in her arms on the far side of the room. My daughter was still crying quietly. My son had his face pressed against his mother's shoulder and wasn't moving. A knock came at the front door. Police. It's safe to open up. I walked to the front door and opened it. Two officers were standing on the porch, calm and professional, flashlights in hand. One of them looked at me and said, "Everyone okay in here?" I nodded. I didn't trust my voice fully in that moment. They came inside briefly, checked the house, confirmed everything was secure. One of them stayed with my family while the other walked me outside to explain what had happened in the backyard. All three figures were in handcuffs, being held near the fence by other officers. And that's when I saw their faces for the first time. The masks were off, and just like the man at the cabin, they didn't look like what I expected. They looked young, painfully young. One of them couldn't have been more than 18. The other two looked barely older. They looked like kids who should have been at home sleeping, not standing in someone's backyard in the middle of the night, wearing masks and carrying knives, because they were carrying knives. All three of them. The officer confirmed it when I asked. Each one had a knife on them, not visible, not displayed concealed, which meant if they had gotten through that glass door, the situation would have been something very different from a break-in. I stood there looking at their faces and felt something I didn't expect to feel. Not relief exactly, not anger, though that came later. In that moment, more than anything, I felt a profound and heavy sadness, because they were so young, because whatever path had brought them to that backyard, to that moment, to those masks and those knives, it hadn't started that night. It had started long before, but then I thought about my son, standing at his window the night before, watching shapes move in the darkness, waving at him, making sure he knew they were there, and I felt something shift in me that the sadness couldn't reach, because that was deliberate. They hadn't stumbled across our house by accident. They had been watching, they had been patient, they had come back more than once. They had specifically chosen a vacation house, a family, children. They had made my son afraid in his own bed on what was supposed to be a family vacation, and they had done it on purpose. The officer I spoke with that night told me something that I've thought about many times since. He said that this particular area had a known problem with groups targeting vacation rentals, specifically families. The reasoning, as far as law enforcement understood it, was that tourists with children were seen as easier targets, less likely to fight back, more likely to comply, more likely to have valuables on hand, and less likely to know the area well enough to feel confident. He said it like it was a familiar problem, like this was something they dealt with regularly. And that bothered me more than almost anything else about the night. Not just that it happened, but that it was common enough to be familiar. I asked him what would have happened if they had gotten through the door. He paused before answering. He said they believed the primary motive was robbery, that in most cases like this, the goal was money and valuables, not violence. But then he said something that stayed with me. He said, "We can't know what someone is capable of once they're inside." And that was the truth, because no one knows. Not the officers, not the people who study these things, and certainly not a father standing in a backyard at him trying to process what almost happened to his family. We didn't stay at that house. We couldn't. My wife made that decision before I even had a chance to bring it up. The moment the officers cleared us to move freely, she started packing. Quietly, efficiently, without drama. She just started putting things into bags, and I helped her. And we got the kids into the car while it was still dark outside. My daughter fell back asleep on the drive. She was young enough that the shock had faded quickly, replaced by exhaustion. My son stayed awake the entire drive. He sat in the back seat and looked out the window and didn't say much. At one point, I looked at him in the rearview mirror, and he caught my eye, and I gave him a nod, just a small one, and he nodded back. That was enough. We found a hotel that night. A regular, ordinary hotel with a front desk and a lobby and other guests in the rooms on either side of us. Thin walls and elevator sounds and all of it. And I have never in my life been so grateful for the sound of other people nearby. My wife and I didn't sleep much. We lay in the dark and talked quietly after the kids were out, going over everything, trying to make sense of it. At some point, she reached over and took my hand, and we just stayed like that for a while without saying anything. There isn't much more to say about what happened to those 3 young men. I don't know the details of the charges or how the legal process played out. I made a decision early on not to follow it. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew that following it would mean staying attached to that night in a way that wasn't healthy for me or for my family. What I do know is this: Airbnb and vacation rentals are not inherently dangerous. Millions of people use them every year without incident, and the vast majority of those stays are exactly what they're supposed to be: comfortable, convenient, and perfectly safe. I'm not telling these stories to frighten anyone away from traveling or from exploring new places. But I am telling you to pay attention, because I learned something across both of these experiences that I wish someone had told me before either of them happened. Isolation is not the same as safety. A remote cabin with no neighbors for miles feels private and peaceful until you realize that the same emptiness that makes it quiet also means no one can hear you if something goes wrong. A vacation house at the end of a quiet street feels relaxed and low-key until you notice that the same low traffic that makes it calm also means no one is watching. No one is passing by. No one is there to notice if something is off. The things that make a place feel safe are often the exact same things that make it vulnerable. So pay attention to your surroundings. Trust the feeling when something seems off. That feeling exists for a reason. Lock your doors. Know where the nearest people are. Keep your phone charged. And if something doesn't feel right, don't talk yourself out of it just because you want the vacation to go smoothly. No vacation is worth your safety. And no amount of good reviews on a listing can tell you what's standing at the edge of the tree line at 2 in the morning, waiting for the lights to go out. Stay safe out there.